This training session is designed for staff working on behalf of NEQOS to help them better understand what confidential information is and the importance of protecting it. The objectives of the session today is to define what we mean by confidential information, to help you improve your understanding of what confidential information is so that you can understand what confidential information you handle. And the aim of doing that is so that you know what information you need to protect and you understand why we need to protect confidential information. And then to finish with, we'll just be giving you some further information on where to get further help should you have any more queries in relation to this. So, confidential information, what is it? There are a number of terms that are used now in relation to information and data and confidential information. People might say it's identifiable, they might say it's confidential. There's personal and sensitive data, which again are different types of confidential data. And then there may be discussions around, well, what is and what isn't confidential information? So is aggregate information confidential? Does it have to be personal level? What if it's pseudonymized? So there's lots of different terms out there that can make it quite confusing to understand what confidential information is and understand why and what you might handle in terms of confidential information. So I'm just going to talk through some of that in terms of in what situations data and information might be confidential or not. Or are there situations where some types of information may be confidential in some situations but not in others? There are a number of different examples of types of information on this slide, which we're going to discuss in terms of whether they're confidential or not. So we're just going to go round there. So the first one we have is terminations in under 16 in local authority area. Clearly, terminations or abortion statistics can be very sensitive information and need to be protected. However, if we're talking about numbers of terminations, it's maybe to be dependent on how many there were in that local authority area. So in quite a large local authority area, you might find that there's quite a number of terminations in under 16s. And in that case, it may be very difficult or impossible to link that specific information back to an individual. And we'll talk a little bit more about small numbers in a minute. IMT security policy. Most policy documents for an organisation are corporate documents, and as such they're public information, so would not be confidential. The only situation we may need to consider in relation to IMT security is whether it includes any detailed security information which could put the organisation at risk, but the majority of IMT security policies wouldn't include that level of information. The one down the bottom here is a quote from confidential interview in a report, and the clue here is in the kind of the description really about it being a confidential interview. So if information is provided in a situation of confidence, then there'll be a duty to protect that information. So it may be that you carry out an interview with a member of staff or a patient and you tell them that there'll be nothing that can be identified back to them will be included in any kind of future reports. So if there's any chance that that information could be matched to that individual by what they're saying in that quote, then you would need to consider that confidential. Back up to the top now, on the right, we have county level readmissions by trust. Now, as you can imagine, there's going to be a large number of readmissions for any particular trust at a county level. So it's likely that this would not be confidential information because the numbers would be too big to be able to identify an individual. Patient level HES data is quite a specific type of information. The data that's provided in HES is often not actually uniquely identified in terms of name and address and that kind of information, but it will still potentially be identifiable because it includes a combination of information that may between them be able to identify an individual or be able to match with some other information that you might have in your possession to be able to identify that individual. So there needs to be great care taken with HES data, And there is specific rules about heads and the numbers of that you can release in relation to heads data, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Staff appraisal record. So in the NHS, there's a lot about protecting patient information, but it's not just about patient information, it's about any individual level data. So that will be personal data about staff as well. And a staff appraisal is clearly a confidential interview between the manager and the staff member, and so should be kept confidential. And the last one, perhaps one of the more obvious ones, is Mr. Smith's social care record. So clearly that's very personal information and potentially sensitive information about Mr. Smith in his social care records, which would have been provided in a situation of confidence, so should be kept confidential. So in terms of considering whether something is confidential, there might be different categories that might make it confidential. So we've talked a lot there about personal information. So if we can identify that to an individual, whether that be a staff member, a patient or a carer, it would be likely to be confidential information. And that's not necessarily about named data. So it might be that even aggregate data, if it's very small numbers, or perhaps line level data out of heads or something like that, that could still potentially be linked to an individual, and in which case we would need to class it as confidential information. But there are other areas of confidential information which aren't just about personal information, and it might be that there's commercially sensitive information in contracts that need to be protected. There might be letters from legal firms that we might need to protect. And there might be situations where sharing of information might be security risks, so that might be about passwords for systems or other IT security related information. There's also something about the context in which that information is given. So if information is given in a situation of confidentiality, and the often quoted example would be the patient-clinician relationship, then clearly we have a duty of confidence to that information. But if it's very much public information, that information is already in the public domain, then it would not be as confidential. So I'm now going to talk a little bit, we mentioned it before, about small numbers and when small numbers might be considered to be confidential information. In 2011, the Department of Health lost a court battle to stop the release of abortion statistics. The case was between the Department of Health and the Pro-Life Alliance over the release of small numbers in relation to late abortions. The Department of Health position was that numbers less than 10 should not be released, due to the potential for either identifying the individual who had the abortion or potentially the clinicians involved in the abortion. However, the High Court overruled this, stating that there was no more chance of re-identifying individuals where the count was less than 10 than when they were over 10. So this led to quite a change in thinking about managing small numbers, because the practice had previously been not to release aggregate data under a certain number. But what they were saying now was that you need to consider the risk of re-identification. And the Information Commissioner's Office released guidance on this through their anonymisation code of practice, which helped people think through what the likelihood was of re-identification in different situations. And it quoted in there the recital 26 of the European Data Protection Directive, which said that the principles of protection should not apply to data rendered anonymous in such a way that the data subject is no longer identifiable. So it's very much saying that you need to make the data anonymous by making sure you cannot identify the individual from that data. And related to this, they talked about the motivated intruder test. So this was a way of trying to say, given the information I've got, how likely is it that that information will be re-identified? So they talked about the motivated intruder. If they had a motivated intruder who wanted to try and work out from the information they had who an individual was, how would they go about that really? So they talked about someone who starts without any prior knowledge but wants to identify the individual, and they presume that person to be reasonably competent, have access to resources such as the internet, libraries and all public documents, and may employ investigative techniques such as making inquiries of people who may have additional knowledge, or advertising with any information to come forward. So it'd be about, would that individual, if they were motivated, be able to identify the individual from the data or from the aggregate data? And certainly some data will be more attractive to a motivated intruder than others, so may make them more motivated. So if there's information that may provide financial gain, may be embarrassing to others, might be useful for political purposes, or maybe, curiosity value if there's a local celebrity perhaps that's been admitted to hospital, certainly that's going to be of interest to the local press and things like that. So it's about, if you were that motivated intruder, how likely is it that you'd be able to identify that information, that individual from that information? So we just discussed whether or not data is releasable based on the risk of re-identification. But the hospital episode statistics, or HES data, has some specific rules set out by the Health and Social Care Information Centre about what can and cannot be released. In particular, it highlights some key areas. It identifies small numbers as being the numbers 1 to 5 and the situations in which it may or may not be appropriate to publish these. It talks about geographical areas and how it would be okay to release numbers 1 to 5 in larger areas, such as nationally, or for government or NHS regions, but not in small areas such as CCGs, local authorities, wards, postcode districts, or organisational level, as this may lead to the identification of individual patients or clinicians. It states that when suppressing numbers, you do not need to suppress zeros, but you may need to suppress at least the next smallest cell in the table to avoid calculation of the suppressed values from the totals provided. It also clarifies that these counts might not necessarily be about individuals. For instance, it could relate to episodes, admissions, or bed days, but they should still be treated in the same way. More stringent criteria are also in place for specific sensitive diagnoses. Figures on certain diagnoses and surgical procedures should not be published, and the most up-to-date lists of these can be found in the HES protocol. It's also worth noting that although the HES data only includes anonymised consultant, GP and referrer data, care should still be taken with this data where other aspects of the analysis could potentially re-identify them. There may also be other ways that the data could be presented to avoid any chance of individuals being identified, and it's worth reviewing the HES protocol and its small numbers schedule routinely to ensure you're fully aware of your responsibilities in this area. So we've talked about confidential information in terms of what it is. We've talked about small numbers and the situations where that might be considered as confidential. What we haven't really talked about is why we might want to protect confidential information. So I'm just going to touch on this briefly. Clearly, that data and that information is about individuals, and usually that information is being provided in a situation of confidence. So that might be a patient, that might be a staff member, but we have a duty to protect that information because, as you can imagine, it would be very distressing for those individuals if their information was shared with the wrong people, was lost, and we would have a duty to inform them if that happened. So we need to protect them. But we also need to protect you as members of staff or organisations working with NEQOS. For staff members involved in an information breach, it can be a really difficult thing to have to go through because you have to go through the whole incident management process. And in the majority of cases, people are doing their best to protect confidential information as best as they can. So we're trying to avoid that happening. Also, potentially for third parties, it may lead to breach of contract. So it's about making sure we give people the appropriate knowledge and skills so that they don't end up in that situation. Because clearly, if it's a breach of local policy, there's potential for disciplinary processes and contractual situations around third parties as well. In terms of the organisation as well, if there's a large breach of data or there's a situation where a specific individual's information is breached, and that might end up in the press or on the internet, it can lead to a real lack of confidence in the organisation and also a risk of a fine for that organisation. They could be prosecuted under the Data Protection Act, and lots of NHS organisations have been fined for not adhering to the Data Protection Act. And also, as a whole, when there are large-scale kind of breaches and incidents, that can have an overall impact on, the public trust in the NHS overall and with public organisations and about the way we handle their information, and may make them less likely to want to share their information with us in future. So I think it's important just to consider, the reasons why we are trying to protect confidential information. So just to summarise then, we've talked about confidential information today, and confidential information you've seen covers a whole range of different types of information. It's not just about patient data. It could be other personal information such as staffing data, information about carers, and it's not also just about personal data. So it could be commercially sensitive data, legal information, it could be information related to IT security where there's a potential security risk. So it's not always very obvious what is and what isn't confidential data. But if you have any doubts about it, you just need to ask. And also report any concerns and issues you may have in relation to this. If you do have further queries on this or would like some further guidance, the Information Commissioner's Office has a lot of detailed information on the Data Protection Act and how to apply that to protect confidential information. This is also reflected in trust policy and procedure, which you'll find in their confidentiality and IT security policies. And also, if you have any queries in relation to this or any other areas around confidential information, you can contact the NEQOS Information Governance Lead, who is Valerie Corris, and her email is provided there below. So thanks very much for your time today, and I hope you found that helpful.